The diner had gone silent. Plates of half-eaten pancakes sat cold. Coffee cups trembled in people's hands, and the smell of fried bacon hung heavy in the air. But nobody was chewing. Nobody was moving. All eyes were fixed on the corner booth, where an elderly black woman, barely able to stand on her cane, was surrounded by 5 menacing figures. Her voice cracked when she said, "Please, just let me be." But the thugs only laughed louder, their shadows stretching across the checkered floor under the dim neon lights. One of them snatched her purse and dumped it onto the table, coins and medicine bottles scattering everywhere. Another leaned in so close she could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. And here's the part that'll haunt you. Nobody stepped in. Not the waitress behind the counter. Not the older couple 2 booths down, not even the cook who peeked through the kitchen door before disappearing again. Fear froze the whole room. Then, just when it seemed like the woman might collapse from the weight of their cruelty, the glass door of the diner swung open. A tall figure stepped inside, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the scene. The air changed instantly. The laughter died. And those 5 men, so loud, so bold seconds ago, suddenly went pale, because they realized who had just walked in. Her son. And if you think you know how this night ended, trust me, you don't. What unfolded inside that tiny roadside diner would spark whispers all across town, leave people questioning their own silence, and expose a truth way bigger than just one family's pain. This wasn't just about disrespect. This was about dignity, survival, and a kind of courage you don't see every day. So let me take you back to where it all began. Before that night at the diner ever happened, before the world saw how quickly things can turn ugly in a place that looks so ordinary, you need to know who this woman was. Because without her story, the rest of this night doesn't hit the same. Her name was Miss Evelyn Carter. Folks around town just called her Miss Evie. She was 68 years old, her back slightly bent from years of working double shifts, and she walked with a polished oak cane that her late husband had carved for her back when life was a little lighter. Every morning, Miss Evie would wheel herself down the cracked sidewalk in her motorized chair, because walking long distances had gotten too painful, and stop by Joe's Diner, that little hole-in-the-wall spot off Highway 19, the kind of place where the coffee's always hot, the bacon's always greasy, and the same 4 old men are always arguing about the Braves. To most people, it was just a diner. But to Miss Evie, it was a lifeline. After losing her husband years back, that booth by the window had become her second home. She'd sip her black coffee, read the local paper, and chat with the waitresses who'd refill her cup without even asking. But here's the thing. Not everybody saw Miss Evie with kindness. See, this was a small town in Georgia, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. But not everyone respects everyone the same. Miss Evie had lived long enough to feel the sting of prejudice in ways most folks couldn't imagine. She'd seen neighbors smile in her face one day, then cross the street the next. She'd heard whispers about her taking up space at the diner booth when business was busy. And there were days she could feel the eyes on her back the moment she rolled through those glass doors. Still, she never stopped coming. That diner represented her dignity, her right to exist in public, to be seen, to be treated like anybody else. And she wasn't alone in her fight. She had a son, Marcus. Now Marcus was nothing like the small-town crowd. He'd gotten out young, earned himself a scholarship, and built a career in the city. He was sharp, quick on his feet, and carried himself with the kind of presence that made people think twice before testing him. But to Miss Evie, he was still that wide-eyed boy who used to sit across from her at the diner, dunking too many sugar cubes in his milk. Their bond was unshakable. Marcus called her every night, no matter how busy life got, and once a month he made the drive down to see her, sometimes surprising her at that very booth with her favorite blueberry muffin. But here's where it gets chilling. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Miss Evie had started telling Marcus about a group of men she'd seen hanging around the diner. They weren't locals, not the regulars anyway. They were rough, loud, always taking up space like they owned the place. And the way they looked at her? It wasn't just rude. It was dangerous. Marcus hated the thought of his mother being anywhere near them. He told her, "Ma, if they mess with you, you call me. Don't you sit there and take it." She would just smile and say, "Baby, I've been taking it my whole life. Ain't nothing new." But deep down she knew something was shifting. The air in that diner felt heavier. The looks lasted longer. The silence from others felt sharper. It was like everyone was waiting for something to happen, but didn't want to be the one to say it. And then came that night. Miss Evie rolled into Joe's diner, just like she always did, smiling at the waitress, ordering her usual, trying to keep her spirit light. But in the far corner, those 5 men were already there, already watching, and she could feel it, the weight of their stares pressing down on her like chains. What she didn't know was that Marcus had already made plans to visit her that evening. He was less than 20 minutes away when it all began, and by the time he walked through that diner door, everything would change. The night started quiet, almost deceptively so. Miss Evie had settled into her booth by the window, her cane leaning gently against the table, the warm glow of the neon Joe's Diner sign flickering outside. She stirred her coffee slowly, letting the steam rise into her face. For a moment she felt at peace, but peace doesn't last long in places where hate is waiting for an excuse. The bell over the diner door jingled, and in they came, 5 men, loud, laughing like they'd already had one too many drinks before even showing up. They weren't from around there. Their boots hit the tile floor heavy like they owned it, and the moment their eyes landed on Miss Evie, something in their smirks twisted. They took the corner booth just a few tables away. Their voices carried across the whole room. "Man, look at this place," one of them barked. "Ain't even worth stopping in, unless you like dining with all kinds of folks." The waitress, young, probably no more than 20, shot Miss Evie a glance, then quickly looked away. She didn't want trouble. Nobody ever did. At first, it was just little things. One of them whistled sharply when Miss Evie adjusted herself in her chair. Another coughed a word that sure sounded like cripple under his breath. Each jab was soft enough to be denied, but sharp enough that Miss Evie felt it slice her pride. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and tried to focus on the crossword puzzle she always carried in her bag. But her hands were trembling too much to hold the pen steady. The diner grew quieter with each passing minute. Conversations that had filled the air earlier, small-town gossip, sports debates, talk about the weather, died out. Now there was only the sound of those men laughing, the clink of their forks, the occasional muttered slur. Miss Evie wasn't new to this. She'd grown up in a world where you learned to survive by swallowing pride, by staying small when people tried to make you smaller. But age had taken her strength, not her dignity, and that's what burned. One of the men finally stood, pretending to stretch but really angling himself closer to her booth. He leaned his elbow on the divider behind her, towering over her like a shadow. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Coffee good tonight? They serve it how you like it? Or do you want me to fix it up for you?" Miss Evie forced herself to look him in the eye. "I'm fine, thank you." That should have ended it. But it didn't. Another one called from the booth. "She's fine, all right. Bet she's used to sitting around doing nothing. What else you gonna do when you can't even walk right?" The words hit her chest like a brick. Her cane stood right beside her, plain for everyone to see, her disability exposed in the cruelest way possible. She wanted to tell them off, to defend herself the way she once would have when she was younger. But her voice caught in her throat, and still nobody moved. The waitress ducked into the kitchen. The old couple near the jukebox looked down at their plates, hands shaking. It wasn't just fear, it was complicity. Everyone was praying it wouldn't get worse, but it did. The tallest of the 5 slid out of his booth and sauntered over. Without asking, he plucked up Miss Evie's crossword puzzle, glanced at it, then laughed. "What's this?" "Big words. You sure you can even read this stuff?" Her lips pressed tight, her eyes wet but unbroken. "Put that down," she whispered. He smirked, tossed the paper back onto the table so it scattered across the floor, and leaned down until his breath was hot against her cheek. Or what? Miss Evie froze. Every muscle in her body screamed to leave, but her legs betrayed her. Her motor chair was parked against the wall, trapped. The tension in the diner was suffocating. People were watching, but their silence was deafening. And the men fed on it, on the knowledge that nobody would stand up to them. Here's the thing, though. Bullies don't just want to scare you. They want to break you. And when one of them reached down and shoved her coffee mug, spilling hot liquid across her lap, Miss Evie gasped in pain. A laugh rang out, sharp and cruel, echoing through the diner like nails on glass. That's when the first real layer of injustice cut deep. Not just that these men were tormenting a disabled black woman, but that an entire room full of people had decided their silence was safer than her dignity. Her hands shook as she tried to wipe herself clean. She whispered something under her breath, maybe a prayer, maybe just a plea for strength. And that's when the leader of the group leaned in again, his voice low and venomous. "You don't belong here. People like you never did." The words lingered in the air like poison, sinking into every corner of that diner. And though Miss Evie didn't know it yet, those words, the cruelty, the humiliation, the attack on her very right to exist were the exact reason her son's arrival would change everything. Because the line had finally been crossed. The hot coffee soaking into Miss Evie's dress wasn't just a sting, it was humiliation. Her trembling hands dabbed at the fabric with a napkin, but the stain spread wide, a dark mark across her chest, like evidence of a crime nobody wanted to acknowledge. The leader of the 5 thugs smirked, satisfied with the scene he had created. And what was worse, nobody moved. Not a single soul. The young waitress peeked out from behind the counter, her eyes wet but frozen with fear. She glanced toward the kitchen window where the cook, a heavy-set man with a grease-stained cap, was watching, but he quickly disappeared the moment her eyes met his. Everyone in that diner made a choice in those seconds, and every single one chose silence. That silence? That was the real weapon. Miss Evie had lived long enough to know that sometimes the cruelest wounds don't come from fists or slurs. They come from the people who should have spoken up, and didn't. Her mind flickered, back to the 1960s when she was just a young girl. She remembered sitting at the counter of a segregated diner with her father, who had told her, "Baby, they'll try to make you feel small, but you look 'em in the eye and remember, you belong here just like they do." Back then she had thought times would change, that one day she wouldn't have to fight just to be seen as equal. But here she was, 68 years old, a lifetime of endurance behind her, and the same demon staring her down in a small-town diner in 2025. The flashback broke as one of the men kicked her cane, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound was loud enough to echo, sharp enough to cut through the quiet room. Everyone heard it. No one picked it up. At the far end of the diner, the older couple, the Hendersons, sat stiff as stone. Mr. Henderson was a retired police officer, his badge long put away but his sense of authority intact. He clenched his fork tight, jaw grinding. His wife whispered, "Do something." But he didn't. He remembered the force. He remembered the rules. Intervening meant paperwork, questions, attention. And deep down he told himself something else too. "It's not my fight." The silence of that booth was louder than the thugs' laughter. 2 booths over, a teenager pulled out his phone. He tilted it low, the screen glowing against his nervous hands. He started recording because that's the world we live in now. People don't step in. They document. His thumb hovered over the post button, torn between broadcasting what he saw or protecting himself from the backlash that might follow. Miss Evie noticed the phone, and a bitter thought pierced her heart. So my pain is entertainment now? The men grew bolder with every passing minute, feeding on the silence, feeding on the fear. One snatched her purse and dumped it across the table again. Her pill bottles rolled across the floor. A blood pressure prescription, insulin, things she needed. They laughed as they rattled on the linoleum. Another tugged at the scarf she wore around her neck, tugging it just enough to make her gasp. "What's this? Hiding behind church clothes? You think Sunday's gonna save you here?" The words stung deeper than the tug. They weren't just mocking her disability or her skin color now. They were mocking her faith, her dignity, her entire being. And through it all, the diner's manager, a balding man with glasses, stood near the register wringing his hands. He knew those men. They were locals, troublemakers with family connections. The kind of guys who could get away with things because their uncles worked at the courthouse or their cousins sat on the town council. If he threw them out, there'd be hell to pay. Maybe vandalism, maybe worse. He looked at Miss Evie, then at the thugs, then back at his register. And like everyone else, he chose to stay quiet. Miss Evie's chest tightened. She reached down to grab her medicine bottle, but one of the men's boots slammed down on it, crushing the plastic under his heel. Pills scattered like marbles across the floor. Her eyes widened. Her breath grew shallow. She needed those pills for the first time. Real fear, not just humiliation, flooded her. This wasn't just bullying anymore. This was survival. Without that medicine, her night could end in a hospital bed, or worse. And here's where the weight of silence became unbearable. Everyone in that diner saw what happened. They saw a disabled elderly black woman being robbed not just of dignity, but of her health, her safety, her life. And still nobody moved. In that moment of panic, her mind went back to Marcus. His voice from their last phone call echoed. "Ma, you let them push you, and I swear if I'm ever there, it won't go down like that. Not while I'm breathing." She clutched that memory like a lifeline, but Marcus wasn't there yet. She was alone. The thugs weren't done. One grabbed a chair and spun it around, straddling it backward right at her table, leaning in close like a predator circling prey. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice low but cutting. "You think anybody here cares about you?" Look around. Miss Evie did, and the truth of his words hit like a dagger. Not a single person met her eyes. Every gaze was averted. Every head was bowed. Her heart broke. Not just from their cruelty, but from the realization that she was truly, terrifyingly alone. What happened inside that diner wasn't just about 5 thugs. It was about a system that had taught them they could act this way without consequence. It was about the fact that the Hendersons, with all their years of law enforcement, knew reporting these men would likely go nowhere. It was about the manager who knew calling the cops might only escalate things, and not in Miss Evie's favor. It was about the waitress whose paycheck depended on staying invisible in moments like this. The whole diner became a microcosm of America, where injustice thrives not just because of aggressors, but because of enablers, bystanders, and systems designed to protect the wrong people. The tallest thug finally leaned back, cracking his knuckles. "Tell you what," he said. "We're just getting warmed up. Hope your night's free." Miss Evie's pulse quickened. Her chest ached. She pressed her hand to her heart, whispering another prayer under her breath. And then, through the neon reflection in the diner window, she thought she saw headlights pulling into the lot. She blinked, unsure if it was hope playing tricks on her, but what she didn't know was that Marcus's car was less than 2 blocks away. He had no idea what he was about to walk into. And those men, so sure of their power, had no idea their night of dominance was seconds away from collapsing. The storm was coming. The diner was suffocating. The smell of burnt bacon and stale coffee mixed with the stench of cheap whiskey off the thug's breath. Miss Evie's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat louder than the next, her breath shallow as she tried to hide the panic swelling in her chest. The men had gone from mocking to menacing, their shadows closing in on her booth like wolves circling prey. The leader, tall, broad-shouldered, his jaw lined with a scruff that gave him the look of someone who thrived on trouble, leaned across her table, his face inches from hers. "You hear me, old woman?" he hissed. "Ain't nobody coming to save you. You're all alone." He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron, his nails digging into her fragile skin. Miss Evie winced, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. The sound triggered laughter from the others. One clapped his hands together like it was entertainment, while another banged his fist against the table in rhythm, chanting, "Showtime! Showtime!" Miss Evie's mind spun. She thought of her husband, long gone. She thought of Marcus, her boy, her protector, the promise in his voice when he said he'd never let anyone hurt her again. She whispered his name under her breath so softly it sounded more like a prayer. Marcus. But Marcus wasn't there, not yet. The leader yanked harder, forcing Miss Evie forward, nearly pulling her cane out from under her. The oak handle clattered against the floor again, the sound sharp, final, like a gavel slamming down. "You think you're better than us?" he snarled. "Sitting here like you own this place? People like you don't belong here." "You never did." Her eyes watered. Not from fear, though fear pulsed through her veins, but from the weight of his words. She had fought her whole life to belong, and here she was, 68 years old, still having to prove she had the right to sit in a booth and drink coffee. Another thug leaned over, snatching the scarf from around her neck, waving it like a trophy. "Look at this. Hiding behind Sunday clothes like she's holy or something." He tossed it to the ground. Then came the shove. The leader pushed her back into the booth so hard her head knocked against the wooden panel. She cried out, the sound piercing the silence of the diner. And yet nobody moved. The waitress covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. The couple near the jukebox squeezed each other's hands but kept their eyes down. The manager rubbed his temples, whispering to himself, "Don't escalate it. Don't escalate it." But it was already escalated. Miss Evie's purse lay open on the floor. Her wallet had spilled out. Family photos scattered. A picture of Marcus as a boy smiling with missing teeth lay face up near one thug's boot. The man noticed it. He bent down, picked it up, and sneered. "Who's this? Your little boy? Bet he's just like you. Weak, helpless." Miss Evie's chest heaved. That photo was her treasure. Her reminder of why she kept fighting, why she kept living. To see it in his dirty hands, mocked and belittled, broke something deep inside her. She reached out desperate, but he crumpled it in his fist and let it fall. Tears streaked her face now. The humiliation was complete. The pain was unbearable, and yet her voice found strength. "You will not break me." It came out hoarse, trembling, but it carried through the diner like a thunderclap. For a moment, even the thugs froze. Her defiance, her refusal to shatter, cut through the tension like a knife. But defiance comes with a price. The leader's expression hardened. "No more mocking. No more games." He stood up straight, his shadow towering over her frail frame. He raised his hand, palm open, the threat unmistakable. The room held its breath. He was about to strike her. Miss Evie closed her eyes. She had been slapped by life in more ways than one, but she had never let a man lay his hand on her without remembering who she was. But she was too weak now, too cornered, too alone. The hand came down fast, merciless. The crack echoed through the diner. Her head snapped to the side. The room gasped collectively, but nobody moved. The sound of her cane rolling across the tile was the only noise after. Her cheek burned, her vision blurred, and her dignity, though wounded, remained. She sat back up slowly, trembling but unbroken, her eyes locking on the leader's with a fire he didn't expect. "You can hit me," she rasped, "but you'll never own me." For the first time, the leader faltered. His sneer flickered. Because he saw it, the unshakable will of a woman who had survived decades of hate, who had walked through fire before and refused to fall now. But rage is a dangerous thing. His pride couldn't handle her strength. He grabbed her by the collar of her dress and yanked her forward, his spit flying as he shouted, "Then tonight, old woman, you're gonna learn who runs this town." The diner was frozen in horror. The teen's phone shook as he recorded, the footage capturing not just violence but cowardice. Every face turned away, every set of eyes that refused to help. Miss Evie struggled for air, her frail hands clawing at his grip. Her chest ached, her body begged for relief. For the first time she thought, this might be it. Her vision blurred again, this time not from tears but from lack of oxygen. Her cane was out of reach, her medicine destroyed, her strength fading. And that's when, through the ringing in her ears, she heard it. The chime of the diner door. The bell jingled, sharp, cutting through the chaos. The leader didn't notice at first. His focus was on her, his rage consuming. But the other thugs did. Their laughter died mid-breath. Their eyes widened. Their bodies stiffened like deer caught in headlights, because standing in the doorway silhouetted by the neon glow was a man they didn't expect. Tall, broad-shouldered, his fists clenched at his sides. His jaw tight with fury, his eyes burning like fire locked onto his mother's trembling figure. Marcus, her son. And for the first time all night, the diner felt air again. Not because the danger had passed, but because the balance of power had shifted. The wolves had circled too long. And now the lion had arrived. The diner door was still swinging when Marcus's fist collided with the leader's jaw. The sound was sharp, bone against bone, a violent punctuation that ripped through the suffocating silence. The leader stumbled back, crashing against the booth, stunned. For a moment, chaos erupted, shouts, scraping chairs, fists half raised. But Marcus didn't let go of his mother. He caught her before she could collapse, his arms wrapping around her trembling body. "Ma, I'm here." His voice cracked with both rage and relief. He pressed his forehead to hers for a fleeting second, grounding her, steadying her breath. Miss Evie's fingers clutched his shirt as though he were her lifeline. They tried to..." Her words dissolved into sobs. "I know. I saw," Marcus whispered, his jaw tightening. He had walked in just in time to witness the hand across her face, the grip at her collar. It was burned into him, carved deep like a scar he'd never forget. The thugs weren't laughing anymore. Two edged toward the exit, mumbling excuses while the leader, dazed but still fueled by hate, spat blood onto the tile. "You think you can walk in here and—" Marcus cut him off, his voice like steel. "Touch her again and I'll bury you where you stand." The room held its breath. Marcus's fury was dangerous, but there was something sharper beneath it. Control. He wasn't a wild brawler. He was a man who had lived with rage for years and learned to aim it. The leader faltered, but pride wouldn't let him back down. "She don't belong here," he sneered, though his words lacked the power they carried before. "None of you do. We run this town." And that's when the first hidden truth cracked open. The diner manager finally spoke, voice low, shaky. "You need to leave, boys, now, before this goes any further." But he wasn't speaking to Marcus. His eyes darted toward the leader's crew, nervous, afraid. The leader smirked, even through a split lip. "Don't worry, boss. Sheriff will smooth this over, same as last time." The words hung heavy. Same as last time. Marcus froze. His chest heaved, fury boiling hotter, not just at the men, but at the system that sheltered them. He understood in an instant why nobody in the diner had moved to help, why the waitress had stood frozen, why the manager hadn't dialed the phone. Because this wasn't new. This was routine. These men terrorized and the law protected them, Miss Evie whispered, broken but clear. "It's always been this way." The silence shattered when the teenage boy finally lowered his phone. His hands shook, but his voice found courage. Not this time. Everyone turned. The boy's face was pale but determined. "I'm posting this. People are gonna see. Everyone's gonna see." The leader's eyes widened, his confidence cracking. He lunged, but Marcus stepped between them, his glare enough to freeze the man mid-motion. The boy's parents pulled him close, but they didn't stop him. In fact, the mother's voice rang out, trembling yet strong. "Do it. Let the world know." For the first time, the tide shifted, not in fists but in voices. The couple at the jukebox stood. The waitress wiped her tears and stepped forward, though her legs shook. Even the manager's mask of neutrality cracked, shame dripping from his silence. The community had been complicit in fear. But fear had a breaking point, and Miss Evie, her face swollen, her body weak, was the spark. Marcus guided his mother gently back to the booth. Sitting beside her, his hand never leaving hers, she whispered, "I didn't want you to see me like this." He shook his head fiercely. "No, Ma, I needed to see. I needed to know." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Every time they get away with it, it grows. Every time we stay quiet, it spreads." Marcus swallowed hard. She was right. He thought back to his own youth. The nights he'd been stopped, searched, humiliated for the color of his skin. He had buried those wounds, but seeing his mother endure the same cut deeper than any memory. The truth wasn't new, but it had been ignored, dismissed, hidden under fear. Now it stood in the middle of a diner, raw and undeniable. The thugs, once bold, now hovered near the door, uncertain. Their leader spat again, muttering threats under his breath, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. He saw it now, the witnesses, the camera, the unbroken spirit in Miss Evie's bruised face. "You ain't won nothin'," he growled, retreating. "This ain't over." Marcus rose halfway from the booth, ready to follow, but Miss Evie's hand squeezed his wrist. "Let them leave," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "They've already lost." Her words landed heavy. Because she was right. For once, the violence hadn't ended in silence. For once, their cruelty had been seen, recorded, remembered. The bell over the door jingled again as the men disappeared into the night, but the echoes of their hate lingered. The diner exhaled. People moved again. The waitress brought ice for Miss Evie's cheek. The boy's mother offered tissues. Strangers who had been silent minutes before now muttered apologies, some even touching her shoulder as if to transfer strength. But the air was still heavy. The injustice wasn't gone. The system still rotten. The sheriff still complicit. The fear still real. Marcus looked at his mother, her frail body trembling but her spirit shining through the bruises, and he realized this night wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The community knew now. They couldn't pretend blindness anymore. And the camera, still rolling in the boy's hands, meant the world would know too. The bell above the diner door finally went still. The thugs were gone, their shadows swallowed by the night, but the silence they left behind was heavier than their presence. Miss Evie sat in the booth, her body trembling, her cheek red from the strike, her clothes stained with coffee. Marcus's hand never left hers. The community, those who had frozen in fear, hovered nearby now, unsure how to repair what their silence had cost. It was in that silence that truth began to sink in. Miss Evie lifted her chin, despite the bruises pulling at her skin. Her voice, though cracked, carried a strength no fists could silence. "They thought they could break me," she whispered, her eyes sweeping the room, "but I'm still here. I've always been here, and I will not be moved." The boy with the phone swallowed hard, tears brimming in his eyes. His video was already live. He whispered that hundreds, maybe thousands, were watching. Strangers across the country now saw what had happened in this little diner in a nowhere town. Miss Evie's pain was no longer invisible. Her humiliation was no longer tucked away in silence. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Marcus squeezed her hand, his jaw still tight with fury, but his eyes softened. "Now the world's gonna know. They can't hide this anymore." But Miss Evie shook her head slowly, her wisdom deeper than anger. "Baby, this didn't start tonight. And it won't end tonight. Those men, they're just symptoms. The sickness runs deeper." She looked at the faces around her. The waitress who had looked away, the manager who had stayed silent, the couple who hadn't moved until it was safe. Her words weren't spiteful, but they carried a truth that made the whole room flinch. "It's not just fists and slurs that hurt us," she continued. "It's silence. It's folks deciding it's safer to look away. That's how hate grows bold. That's how injustice survives." The diner was quiet again, but not with fear this time. With shame, with reflection. Marcus felt the weight of her words. He thought of his own life. The traffic stops where he was forced to step out of his car, hands shaking. The jobs that slipped away because someone else was a better fit. The way neighbors clutched their purses tighter when he walked by. It wasn't just 5 thugs in a diner. It was a system. It was centuries, and everyone in that room was a part of it, either feeding it, fighting it, or letting it rot untouched. But Miss Evie's eyes softened as she looked at the teenage boy again. "And sometimes," she said, "hope comes from the unlikeliest places." The boy straightened under her gaze, his phone still in hand. His small act of courage, pressing record when grown adults froze, had shifted everything. He hadn't stopped the violence, but he had made sure it couldn't be hidden. "You didn't stay quiet," she said to him. "You remembered that silence is its own kind of violence, and that means maybe the next generation has a chance to do better." The boy's lip trembled. He nodded, a tear slipping free. Marcus looked around the diner and realized that for the first time the people who had stayed silent were now speaking. Softly, apologetically, but speaking. A few offered to testify if charges were pressed. The waitress promised she'd back up whatever Marcus and his mother needed. Even the manager, shame heavy in his eyes, muttered, "I should have called the sheriff. I was scared. I was wrong. It wasn't redemption. Not yet, but it was something. A crack in the wall of indifference." By the time paramedics arrived, called by someone outside who'd witnessed the chaos, Miss Evie was steadier. Her cheek was bruised, her body sore, but her spirit unshaken. As they helped her into the ambulance, Marcus leaned close. "I'll fight this, Ma. I'll make sure they don't get away with it." She smiled faintly, her hand brushing his. "Baby, you've been fighting your whole life. This time, don't fight alone. Make them all fight with you." Her words carried like a charge through the air, echoing not just for Marcus, but for everyone who would watch that video, who would see her bruised face and hear the venomous words of those men. Later, when the video spread online, racking up views in the millions, the world reacted with outrage. Some demanded justice, some dismissed it as another isolated incident. But for anyone who truly listened, for anyone who really saw Miss Evie, the question lingered long after the clip ended. How many times does this happen when no camera is rolling? How many elders suffer in silence unseen? How many voices go unheard because no one stood up? No one pressed record, no one dared to say this is wrong. And deeper still, what role do we play when we look away? When we let it slide? When we stay silent because it's easier? Miss Evie's story wasn't just hers. It was a mirror, one that forced the audience to see not just 5 thugs in a diner, but the society that made them bold enough to attack a disabled black woman in public, believing no one would stop them. Miss Evie healed slowly in the weeks that followed. The bruises faded, but the scar of the night would remain, yet she refused to be defined by what was done to her. She sat on her porch each evening, watching the sun dip below the trees, her cane at her side, her spirit unbroken. Neighbors visited more often now, not out of pity but out of respect. Strangers sent letters, prayers, donations. The boy visited too, his phone tucked away, his eyes shining with the knowledge that he had made a difference. And Marcus, he didn't just file charges. He started something bigger. Meetings. Marches. Conversations that spread from the diner to the town, from the town to the state, from the state to the nation. Because Miss Evie was right, the sickness ran deep, but so did resilience. And as long as voices refused to stay silent, there was still hope. So to anyone listening, to anyone who saw her story, who felt her pain, the question remained, when the next diner moment happens, will you freeze? Or will you stand?